Hello everyone and welcome to the March edition of Techspert Talks. I'm Troy Rainey and I'll be your host for today's session. Today's presentation is Debugging Qlik Application Automation with Emil Kozlowski. Emil, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I'm Emil. I came on board at Qlik during the Blender acquisition back in 2020. I work in the application automation customer first team.
Great, thank you. And today we're going to start with an introduction of what Qlik application is. We're going to take a look at some connectors and templates and get in some details about some of those. And then we're going to dive into debugging some more complicated automations and the details therein. Emil, for those of us who are kind of new to this feature, could you please explain what Qlik application automation is?
So Qlik application automation is this low-code editor that allows you to build integrations with Qlik Sense and various other online platforms. There's a lot of possibilities here.
Okay, and this is a feature of Qlik Sense SaaS, right? Qlik Cloud.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's only available for enterprise SaaS versions.
If someone is new to this, where are some resources where they could find some basics and how to get started?
Yeah, if you just go to the Qlik webpage, you go to products and data services, and then the last one, application automation, you'll find a lot of information about the product itself and a few useful links to get you started.
And is this a free feature?
Well, it's included in the enterprise SaaS license, so everyone with the license has access to automations for free until 5,000 runs a month.
5,000 automation runs.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, great. What automations do you want to take a look at today?
The GitHub automations are interesting, and app management.
All right, so how should we get started?
If you want to build an automation, you just go to your Qlik Sense tenant in SaaS.
Okay.
You go here to add new. From the drop-down, you pick new automation. And this prompts you with the template picker. And it's automations that are pre-configured.
Yeah, I see a lot of options there, especially different ways to sort them. You got different categories.
Indeed, yeah. You can choose from a few categories or you can choose by connector. These templates are a good place to start if you're new.
Okay.
You'll get an idea of what's possible.
So how do we find the GitHub template?
Yeah, we could just search, we could scroll through, we can even filter by GitHub, and then it'll only show templates that use the GitHub connector.
Okay.
We have two. Start with the template that will commit apps to GitHub. For every template we have this detail overview, and then for every template there's also a community article that shows you more detail how the template is built.
Oh wow.
Gives you a thorough explanation of every block.
Yeah, that's really great, getting all the details and having screen grabs and explaining the different steps. That's excellent. Okay, so the purpose of this template is to put an app on GitHub so that we can start collaborating and creating some version control for creation of apps, right?
Yeah, indeed.
And what is GitHub?
GitHub, it's an online code collaboration tool. We will be using it to allow collaboration for Qlik Sense apps.
Okay, so let's dive in. How do we get started using this template?
Well, only one button. Clicking this button, Use Template, it will install a copy of the automation that's behind the template inside your tenant. So now this is immediately installed in my tenant, and as you can see, I have here the full automation. I have all the blocks are already there, everything is configured, except of course for my tenant specific information.
Okay.
Alright, so let me now just quickly configure this template. I'll enter all my tenant specific settings. I'll show you what it does, and then afterwards I'll dive into the details.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we'll see it run and then we can dive in.
Now the template is configured. It took us only a few seconds.
Yeah, that was quick.
So I here have my Qlik Sense tenant open again, and this consumer sales app.
So that's the app we're sending to GitHub for collaboration and version control.
Yeah, as you see here in this template, it's executed whenever an app is published. Let's just trigger the automation by publishing this app.
Okay, so that automation takes basically all the architecture and bare bones of that app and puts it on GitHub.
Yeah, indeed.
And that's triggered by the publishing of the app.
Yeah, we'll trigger the automation. The app is published to the managed space. And if you take a look here on GitHub, in our app versioning branch, 3 new files were created.
Okay, so the automation created all those files from your app.
Yeah, indeed. The first one is the load script. Yeah, I think everyone knows what that is. Then it also stored a JSON file. We have these headers.
So it's kind of comments telling what the content actually is. Okay.
Exactly. So here we have a few sheets. Then here we have an overview of all the objects on those sheets.
Okay. It's just kind of like a receipt of what's in the app.
Exactly. And then finally, you have the QVF file, which is the binary export file of the app without data, just the structure of the app.
So the concept here is put a copy of it up on GitHub. People can collaborate, suggest improvements, make comments, and you can see the difference between versions as you go.
Indeed. I'll create a new version of my app here. This is our source app.
Okay.
Let's remove this button. We're done editing. And we want to publish a new version of this changed app.
And in the background, that triggered the automation you already have set up, right?
Indeed, that triggered the automation again. You see our 3 files again. And the timestamps, the JSON file and the QVF file, those 2 were changed.
Right.
So if you now go to the history of that file,
Okay.
you can see here all the different versions of that file. We see here what was changed.
Okay, so it highlights in red things that were removed and green things that were added.
Yeah, and go back to the automation.
Yeah, could you walk us through the automation a bit more and help us understand how that was configured?
This first block, the first block of any automation is always the start block, and the start block has a few run modes.
That's basically the trigger that will kickstart the automation.
Indeed, you can do it manually by always clicking the green run button. You can put it on a schedule. When it's in triggered run mode, you can do it through API calls.
Okay.
And then we have webhook automations, and that allows you to almost natively subscribe to an event in a connector. Then we can select an event we want to listen to. In this case, it's the app published event. We added a filter option, which allows you to register to app published events only in one space.
So basically, the connector Qlik services is listening for activities and events happening in your tenant, and you're setting it to listen to a specific space, and any apps published in that space will trigger this automation.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay. Is there a way to filter it even closer to listen for a specific app in that space?
That's not possible through the webhook. We want to listen to one specific app, as you say. So we had to build checking inside of the automation to make sure that the automation only continues to run on the right app that was published. That's what we do in here in this get app information block. We specify it in the comments. That's also a tip. If you're working with templates, please read all the comments.
Okay.
Also a tip, just right click all the blocks you have, edit comments, and then you can yourself specify these comments.
Oh.
And it makes it way easier to collaborate on automations and to understand what's happening.
That's cool.
You have to specify
the source app, right?
Yeah, indeed. There are a few options. In this case, you can either the lookup, which will list the first 500 apps in my tenant. Easy way to get app IDs.
Because it's looking for the specific app ID string.
Yeah, indeed. This field here requires the app ID string.
What happens if someone just enters the name of the app there?
Yeah, it won't work. It will throw an error. Let me show you. We're immediately taken to the error page.
Okay.
We received an error.
Okay, so automation sent an API call to Qlik Cloud Services with an app name, but it was listening for an app ID number, so it returned a 404 error.
Yeah, of course, this API expects an app ID and not an app name. So it makes sense that they didn't find anything.
Okay.
Sometimes you get some errors here, and it might be confusing from which block it came. Maybe you have these multiple get app blocks.
Yeah.
What I like to do is I go to the chronological view or the per block view. It's maybe easier to see which block has thrown the error.
Now back to the editor. Oh, it highlights the block in red.
Yeah, it immediately shows you where the error was. Always use the lookup if you can. It's annoying here. We have 2 consumer sales apps, and because one got published.
All right, so it's picking up the source and the published app.
Yeah. So what you can do then is you just go to the app you want to use. Inside the URL, you get the app ID from here.
Okay.
Go back to the automation.
So we can identify that as the source app. Would you recommend changing the name of source apps, like something like source?
Yeah.
It's out there.
It's a good practice. You could just say development app in the source, and then you rename it when you publish it.
Okay.
That's a good practice, actually.
And I see we've got a variable in the next block.
Yeah. Variables, you can just configure them as you like. Here we have a settings variable which is of type object, and yeah, as an object has key values, so that's something you can do with this variable. You can set key values. Of course, in the template it's already done.
Okay, so this is where you can store your GitHub connection settings for all the other GitHub blocks, so you only need to enter those settings in one location.
Yeah, indeed. You only have to enter it once, and if you want to make changes, you only have to make them in one place.
Okay.
And then here in the settings block, we have one final key, app ID for backup.
Is this setting referring to the source app and published app from the previous block?
Yeah, indeed. And this allows you to select which of those two you actually want to listen to, the origin app ID or the published app ID, which of those two you want to use.
Okay.
And then here the condition block will compare these two. A condition block is just like an if statement in coding.
Okay, so this one is checking if the correct app is published.
Indeed. If the correct app is published, we will give an output. So in this case, it's saying that a certain app was published, it's starting the export to GitHub, and then in the other case, we are aborting the automation.
Okay.
And then this top block
would stop the automation there.
Indeed. So these output blocks, really useful when debugging. You can just go to the output of an automation, and here under output, there we see that this automation does not have an output, but we have output blocks. So why is that? If you take a look at the chronological overview,
we didn't get to it.
Indeed, we didn't get to it. Whenever an automation has a block with an error, it will stop at that block.
That makes sense.
Right, so let me show you a block that does have an output.
Okay, so this is a similar automation that did finish, I see there.
This is exactly the same automation.
Okay.
And here we see the output block. It says the app was published and the app export is started.
So in that run, it did what we were expecting it to do.
Indeed.
Can you quickly walk us through the rest of this automation, what those blocks do?
After the automation knows it's the right app that was published, it will start the export to GitHub. So this block, it will export the app to a base64 encoded file. And then if you take a look at the GitHub block, which will create the file or update the file.
I see it's picking up that information from previous blocks.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay.
Then load script. But load script is a textual value. So we have to encode it before we can send it to GitHub. To do this encoding, first step would be to map the output of the getLoadScript block.
So it picks up the data from the previous block?
Yeah, indeed. You want to map outputs from certain blocks as inputs to other blocks. To click the field by the blocks where you want to use it as an input. This gives you a drop-down of all the previous blocks. So all the blocks are executed one by one.
Okay.
And I want to use the output of the getLoadScript block. Immediately here I see a history.
Very cool.
Most blocks will also have an example output, but I see the getLoadScript block does not have one. You can also scroll to previous runs. Also, what you do here is you configure the mapping to the output of the block.
Okay.
If I'm scrolling through this, yeah, it will still be the same mapping. So it's not that it's taking a previous run. It's always taking the output of this block. It will take it when the automation is executed.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. Then we need to encode this because it's a string. Click here, add formula. This menu appears. A few programming functions. The one we're using is base64 encode. Alright, and just like this, we can apply a formula.
Okay.
And then finally, we get the bare bones of our app, and we store this all in one variable. It's called app.json. First, we get all the sheets of our app, and we add those to the JSON file, the objects on the sheets, the dimensions, and so on, the measures, the variables, the fields, and then finally, we also store that as a JSON file then in GitHub.
Cool. So it basically is building the JSON file with all the list of everything in the app, and then copying that JSON file to the GitHub location.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay. We saw this all work fairly smoothly. Is this saved automatically, by the way? All the changes we've made?
Well, yes. Now, if I would refresh this page, so I made a few changes, I didn't save it. I get prompted.
So you want to keep all those unsaved changes, make sure you check that box.
Yeah.
That's great. So what should you do if things aren't working as expected?
A great thing to start with here is the test payload, which means if I execute this automation manually, then it will always use this test payload. It looks like a real payload, but it's not.
Okay.
It's just an example of some tenant, not mine. You can just execute it manually, but if I do that, it will take the information from the test payload, and as you can see here, yeah, the app is not exported.
Oh, because our automation is looking for a specific app, and when you just manually trigger it instead of using the webhook, it'll pick up the test payload data instead.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, that's interesting.
The trick here is, and you can go to the history. When debugging, this history overview, it's very valuable. If you're mapping these blocks together, it's the first place to take a look if something goes wrong.
That's great that you can scroll through and see all the history right here in the editor.
But maybe it was working. Today, everything went wrong. And then I might scroll through this history. What was the payload yesterday? What's the payload today?
Okay.
The latest one, I'm afraid, you see it's still from the example value. So we don't want to use this one. But then here we have an actual result. So we can then copy that. To do that, we need access to the real JSON.
Okay.
Click toggle view mode.
All right.
And this will show you the actual JSON and then we can copy it. And Control C. Go back to inputs of this block, and here in test payload, we select it all, Control V, and now we have an actual test payload. If you now execute the automation, it is picked up.
Okay, so that replaced the test payload with an actual historical payload, and now it works.
Yeah, indeed.
What are some common problems that people might run into when setting one of these things up?
A common mistake is that you don't configure it properly, or you forget to configure a few blocks.
Okay.
So let me simulate that.
All right, yeah. So you're just now quickly kind of breaking it or removing some settings.
Yeah. So let's say now I've installed this template for the first time. The first step is to try to save it.
Okay.
Because then you're prompted immediately.
Invalid blocks.
Yeah, indeed, all the invalid blocks that don't have the right configuration.
Okay. So that actually went through the whole automation and picked out the things that have some issues that you need to resolve.
Yeah, indeed. So we see the app ID is missing.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and fix that. Let's start here with GitHub. Yeah, I get prompted by GitHub asking me to give consent to Qlik application automation to use my GitHub account. I sign in, click continue, and then you redirect it to automations and the connection is linked. And now everything is alright.
Okay.
Then we have one more mistake in our automation, app ID.
Do you recommend always using the do lookup?
Yeah, indeed. Always use it. The only reason not to use it is if you have more than 500 apps.
Okay.
And then you could copy it from the app itself.
Okay.
Let's maybe dive a bit more in manual error handling. And let me show you what I actually mean by manual error handling. Again, we've entered the wrong ID. If we run it, the block will throw an error. Even though a block throws an error, you still want to continue the automation. Okay.
I'm a little surprised right now why that block isn't popping up in red, even though it threw an error.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I have no idea. I think it's not popping up in red because from a configuration point of view, the block is configured correctly.
It has some data in the field, right?
Yeah. And if I make this empty, then it pops up in red again.
Okay. But as you were saying, if you want to try and test things out and have it skip a block, what would you do?
Then I would disable the block. So you can just right click it. Then from the menu that shows, you select disable block.
Okay.
And if you then would execute the automation, let's keep it at just these blocks for now. If you execute the automation and you take a look at the blocks that were executed, you see that the get app information block, it should be between these two. But it's not there because it's disabled.
Okay. So it just hopped over that.
Yeah, indeed. But then you should be aware that the output of this block will also not be available in the automation.
Right.
Let's say you're building bigger automations. Say this is a GitHub repo I've shared with my teams. I actually don't want to bug them when I'm building this automation, so just disable these blocks. It's now disabled all GitHub blocks. And if I now execute the automation, nothing will be written to GitHub system. All the other calls are executed. But I want to know what the result is of app.json. But yeah, I don't want to send it to GitHub because I don't want to bug my colleagues.
Okay.
I could search for the output block and then give myself this overview of the app.json block right before I send it to GitHub.
Okay, so you would have a result that you could check before you actually publish it
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
publicly to your colleagues, yeah.
Yeah. If I now run it. By the way, if the automation is running, you don't have an overview in the per block, but you do have one in the chronological view.
Well, that's interesting.
The max runtime is 1 hour. Alright, so if you're using automations and you want to see a specific block, the chronological overview, it's really nice to see the order in which blocks are executed.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to find a specific block in here.
Yeah.
You could search, but you could also just use the per block overview. There's only one record for every block.
Okay, and that would be why the chronological is kind of hard to see, because there's 371 executions of the JSON variable.
Yeah. Also, the order of this table, that's in a random order. We want to take a look at the output block. It was output 3, and then here we have, we see the JSON before it's sent to GitHub.
Okay, so that's the end result you're trying to create.
Of course, automations is not an editor, so if you want to do a deeper dive, just copy it and use whatever code editor you want to use.
Okay.
Alright, and then of course we use an output block, so we also have it in here. Let's leave these blocks disabled for now, and I want to show you the manual error handling. Again, we made a mistake in this block, and we want to now verify, see whether this block has an error or not. We can use a condition block. It's like an if statement. We can access the state of the automation, like an overview of the errors. That's something you have to type manually, so you kind of have to know it. It's also on the help documentation of automations.
Okay.
But it's like this: $.state.block name.error. Block name, of course, that's get app information. So this won't work, it needs to be something else, but I've already typed it, the mapping is already here. So if you want to edit a mapping, you can here click this toggle formula parsing.
Okay, so that brings it back to its text form.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. Can easily make changes to this. Now, get app information. In the UI, it looks like it's all caps, but behind the scenes, it's also possible that there are some underscores you don't see or some hidden characters. So when you're manually working with block names, I really advise you to first make a mapping to that block. Like this, you use the output of get app information. And then, of course, if you haven't, then you need to toggle the formula parsing. And then here you'll see the actual block name.
Okay.
And then copy that thing.
So by mapping, you can see the actual character-specific spelling of block names. And once you have that true spelling, you can copy and use that.
Yeah. Like this, you reduce the risk of errors. And then I can now say, if this error, if it's not empty, meaning we have an error, then I want to do something. And of course, for now, I only want to see it. And then later, we can make this smarter.
Okay.
And then I want also this error, so I can just copy this mapping, like this. Let's try to run this.
Okay, so it's checking the app. If it runs into an error, it should give you an output.
Of course, I think, yeah, Troy, you already know what went wrong here.
Yeah.
The automation only executes until the block that throws an error.
So if it stops before that condition, how can you check for errors inside the block?
You go to the settings of the block.
Okay.
And then here you can define the on error setting, and you have a few options. It's always by default set to stop the automation if an error occurs.
Okay.
But you could also set it to warning or ignore. If you set it to warning, the error is still thrown, but the automation just continues. And if you set it to ignore, the error isn't even shown. Warning, yeah, that's what we need right now. We still want the error.
Okay.
We also need to execute the next box.
So if we execute this now, it should run, but with a warning.
It's finished, indeed, with a warning, so you can see that there are warnings. We have outputted it as well. Now, the output view, it will always try to make things prettier, and it's very useful if you're working with lists, because you'll have this nice overview of columns of what's inside the list.
Okay.
But for objects, I don't really like it that it's like this. So you can go to again to the per block overview. For me, this is easier to see what's going on. Again, we get the actual error that was thrown, so we can now use this error to maybe we want to alert someone on our team that there's something wrong with the automation. For that, we could use the Slack connector, for example. use a send message block on that connector.
Okay, so you could set it up to alert somebody with a Slack message if there's an error.
Indeed, yeah. Now, the use case, you don't want to do it when the get app information fails.
Yeah.
Maybe a better, let's maybe move to a better use case for this manual error handling. That I think is also very valid use case. For example, if you want to do, if you're working with task chains, and it happens sometimes that the reload, that it failed. Let's also detach this part of the automation and now focus on this reload.
Okay.
So it happens a lot that reloads fail. So in this case, you can alert someone in your team to take a look at the load script and maybe also include a bit information of the load script. Let's say use our app. When you're doing a reload, in this scenario we want to wait for the reload to complete.
Okay.
The thing with the reload block is it won't easily throw an error, because if a reload fails, this block doesn't throw an error, but it will just output the result of the reload. So we can, in here, so we would no longer listen to this error, but we will just say here, if the output from the reload, if the status does not equal succeeded, and then I want to send a message to my team in Slack.
Okay. So now it's doing
Of course,
a lookup to Slack, but it can't connect.
Indeed, because I still have to I have to create a connection to Slack.
Okay.
Here again, let's allow it. Alright. And now I should be able to do the lookup. Yeah, let's not send it to general. Here I made one for me. And then in here you can include the output of the reload. So if it failed, I probably want to include the log.
That's great.
You can also use line breaks and maybe the app ID. And just like that, you can also do some sort of error handling for reloads, and now immediately my team would be alerted if something goes wrong with the reload.
That's very cool. Emil, what other tips do you have for troubleshooting automations?
One more thing I want to share is limiting the output of certain blocks, especially list blocks. If you're working with other systems, I think with Google Sheets, that's for sure a prime suspect for this.
Okay.
For example, this block, I won't go into too much detail, but it would return a list of records from a certain sheet.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm building, I don't want to process the full list of 1,000 records every time, so I can just go to the settings of the block, and here I can specify a maximum number of items to retrieve.
Okay, so that could limit it and help speed things up.
Indeed, yeah. So you can have a lot more iterations when you're building the automations. Pick a low number, and it will be much faster for you.
Okay. And how do you know if a block is actually the kind of block that's pulling a list?
You can see that here by this structure you see below the block. We call this the loop structure.
Okay.
And if you see that on a block, it will return a list. And of course, how does the structure work? Every block you drag inside the structure will be executed for every list that's inside. That's returned in this case by Google Sheets.
Okay.
So, for example, here I have a list of apps, and I want to get some information from an app and send it to Slack. And these will be executed for every item in the list.
Well, that's a very good tip on how to limit the execution of that so it doesn't do it for ginormous lists, especially when you're developing the automation.
Yeah, it will save you a lot of time.
Now, I was wondering about these test runs. Every time you hover over a block, it says test run.
Yeah, indeed.
How would you recommend using those, or how do those work?
If you hover over test run, you get the explanation. So this test run, it will execute the automation until the block you've clicked it for. So after that block, the automation will stop.
Okay.
So if I now do, for example, a test run here for do reload, I got a pop-up, but I was still able to do the test run.
Oh.
And then in here, I get the result of my test run. I see it in the history, and it's marked with test run. And that's easy if you just want to quickly do a run without executing the full automation. One important thing about test runs you should know is they are still executing the blocks. So if I would here have a delete app block, and you might think, oh, it's only a test run, so it won't be executed for real. That's not true. The delete app block will be executed if you do a test run, and your app will be deleted.
Okay, so even though it says test, it is a live execution.
It's an actual, yeah, indeed, it's a live execution, and it also counts towards your 5,000 executions limit.
With the standard Qlik Sense Enterprise license, you're allowed to have 5,000 automation runs per month.
Yeah, indeed.
But that is expandable, and it's not a hard limit. But if you go
Yeah.
over that, you might get a call from a salesman asking if you want to expand.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay, well, that's good to know. What are some other features you can play with when you're developing automations?
I think one thing we didn't go over yet is these two buttons here, download workspace, upload workspace.
Okay.
Today, automations, they are only my personal space.
Okay.
If you want to collaborate on automations, we are working on this, we will improve this, but today the only way to do that is to download a certain workspace. This will give you a JSON export of the automation.
Ah. And then how would someone from your team use that exported automation?
You can start with a blank automation, or just any automation, but it's best to start with a blank one. And then they can choose upload workspace, and then they can select the file you've shared with them to import the automation to their account.
Very cool. So it just basically exports a copy, and then someone else can take that and apply it on their tenant.
Important to note here, and now I'm doing it in my own account, in my own tenant, so these connections are still linked, but the connections are not included in the export. If I would send it to you, Troy, then you wouldn't be able to access my Slack account. That's all scoped to my personal Qlik account.
Okay, so it wouldn't bring over those connection details.
Indeed.
That's good to know. As a part of collaboration, is there any way you can have some notes for the people you're sharing this with, or some way to explain exactly what you're trying to do here?
Yeah, indeed. You can use the comments on every block to give a bit of context to what that block is actually doing. If you're collaborating, give every block a comment.
I can see that being very valuable to explain exactly why the block is there and what it's doing. That's a good tip.
For condition blocks, it makes even more sense. If you look at this, there's no way to know.
Yeah, what the condition is, what it's doing.
Even the question mark makes that even clear. So we're checking if it's not succeeded, the reload status. So reload failed question mark. And now it immediately makes sense. It's after the reload block. Everyone knows what the block does.
It's amazing how a simple extra step, it clarifies it for everyone in the future, including yourself.
Yeah. If something goes wrong, just take a look at the description of the block to really make sure that you've configured it in the right way. For some blocks, you'll find that there are articles that can guide you to really understand how to use the block or to see if there is any useful information there.
Yeah, that's a really valuable resource. It's good to be aware of that. All right, well, now it's time for Q&A. Please submit your questions through the Q&A panel on the left side of your On24 console. Emil, we got a lot of questions coming in. Should we just start from the top?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Will Qlik application automation be only for SaaS version?
Yeah. For now, a Qlik application automation is only available in the SaaS editions of Qlik Sense Enterprise.
Okay. Next question. How can one see the contents of variables from the automation interface?
So, you have two types of variables here. You have variables inside an automation, and you have variables in Qlik Sense.
Right.
So, if you want to access a variable inside an automation, that's not actually possible when you're building the automation. So if you're working with variables, so let's create a variable, and if I want to set the value of this variable will only get its value set when this block is executed, and then further along the automation it will be available, but there's no way to now know which, of course here I can see the value was set to test value, but sometimes you get these values from other blocks. For example, they get app information block. If I would map it like this, and I would set it to the output of my app information, for example, the name of the app, this will only resolve when the automation is executed. So there's no way of knowing the value of this variable when I'm building.
It has to have complete running at least once.
Yeah, it has to run at least once, and then you will know. So if I now execute this, yeah, I will know what the value was here in the output of the run. Here I can see what the value was during this run. But yeah, maybe, of course, this will always return this app, but if I change it, yeah, what I have here in the variable, in the history, is still from the previous run. So it would have to execute again to, yeah, it only has a value during execution.
Okay.
And if you want to work with Qlik sense variables, then you can use the list variables block to take a look at your Qlik sense variables. But again, those are totally unrelated to the variables inside automations.
Right. I didn't know that list variables block was available, so that's interesting. Next question. If someone can't find automations, can you show us again how to get started?
Alright, so you just go to your tenant, go to add new automation, and then you're prompted with the template picker. You can choose any automation or any template from here, or start with a blank one. If you don't have this feature available, yeah, I think it's best to contact your Qlik Sense administrator or your sales rep and ask them for more information about why it's not visible.
Okay. The next question is, what kind of limitations are on automation?
A lot, because yeah, it's not, you can't do everything with it, of course. I think the main limitation you should know is that per tenant you can only execute 5,000 automations every month, or that's at least the free limit included in every enterprise SaaS license, and an automation can only run for 1 hour at a time. So this is also a very, very interesting page about all the limitations in Qlik application automation. If you think you're hitting the limits, take a look here and you'll know for sure.
Great.
Yeah.
And we'll definitely include the link to this so
Yeah.
people can find it easily. Kind of a follow-up question that's similar. How can I see how many runs are already used of the monthly automation limit?
For now, it's not possible to see for yourself how many automations you've used. Of course, we think that it's very important to know, so we're working on making this information available to everyone. But for now, you just ask your sales rep inside Qlik to give you the number, and they should be able to help you.
What is the pricing and licensing model for Qlik application automation?
So if you have a Qlik Sense Enterprise SaaS license, you have the free tier, and then there are more tiers available, and it's best to contact your account manager for more details.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways to increase that free limit, but yeah, it's always best to contact your account manager. Next question, is it possible to build an automation to perform a Qlik server health, like a health check?
No, we don't have access to, or we don't have any connections in automations to Qlik server.
Okay. What is needed to create automation with some ERP system?
Well, yeah, what's needed is that we have blocks for such ERP system. You should know when you're working in automations, and let me show you inside the editor. We only have connectors for a set amount of platforms. We didn't add every platform, every SaaS platform, or every API in the world. So here on the left, you have the overview of all the blocks you can choose from. Here are my connectors I connected with for now, and I also have an overview here in the other connectors of systems, platforms, connectors I didn't connect with yet. But in here you'll find the overview of all the available connectors, of course inside the editor, and we also have a help page on that and on the community, where you can find an overview of all the connectors we have and links to. So if you're here, so I'm now in the Qlik application automation forum. I got here by going to forums, data integration, Qlik application automation. Then here under connectors, I can choose to explore all connectors, and this will take me to an overview of all the connectors that are in Qlik application automation today.
Wow, that's a great resource. I wasn't aware of that.
Let's say I want to work with GitLab. then this will take me to an overview of all the articles we have now for GitLab. And yeah, it's always a getting started article, at least. And that's a great place to start with new connectors.
Great.
And we are adding new connectors every month, so this will continuously change. If you're missing something, feel free to reach out to us with the ask for a new connector, and we'll be very happy to investigate that.
Okay, great. Next question. Can this be used to execute task reload chaining in SaaS?
Yeah, definitely. That's actually one of the first use cases we try to cover with automations. And if you go to the template picker, you'll see that we actually have a few automations around this and around reloads. So yeah, they begin very basically. So reloads apps in parallel, reload apps as a task chain, and then even about notifying your team depending on how reloads go. I think this one might be an interesting one. So let's take a look. And here you see these multiple, how you can do multiple reloads as a task chain. And of course, you can add much more, as many as you like. One thing to take in account is, I know reloads for bigger apps, they can take a long time, and the automation runtime is limited to 1 hour, but we have designed a workaround for this.
Okay.
We've also written an article for it. And here the idea is that you actually build a few automations, and they use Google Sheets to keep track of apps you've already reloaded.
Okay.
So it's more of a system solution with multiple automations. And then you have one that will start the first reloads and then update those values in a Google Sheets file. And then you have another automation that's scheduled. This one, the second one, it will run on a schedule every X minutes, and it will see if any reloads have finished, and then trigger new reloads if necessary. But this is a more advanced use case, but please take a look. I think it's very useful when it comes to task chaining.
Absolutely, that sounds like a very smart solution to that problem. Okay, next question. Will automations be able to move apps from a managed space to a shared space?
Well, I'm not the biggest expert on what's possible in Qlik Sense when it comes to apps. We do have a block to move apps, but when it comes to these questions, is this possible to do through automations? I want to do this in Qlik Sense. Can I also do it through automations? The first question you should ask is it possible to do it in the Qlik Sense UI? And yeah, if it's not possible to do it in the UI, you most likely won't be able to do it in automations either, except if it's like a use case that we've really covered with automations. But doing things around app management, renaming apps, publishing apps, moving apps, if you can't do it in the UI, you can't do it in automations. So in here, I don't see any way to move this back to a shared space. So yeah, that's not. I think it's not possible to do through automations.
That makes sense.
That's a great rule of thumb.
Yeah.
These management questions, just try it in the UI, and if it's worked there, it should also work in the automation.
Okay. Next question. Can I limit the number of runs for a specific user?
No. Today that's not possible. Yeah, I think that's something we're looking in as well, to give a more granularity when it comes to building and managing automations. Add more features around that for more of the enterprise use case. And yeah, I think this is one of the things we will include for sure, to have user level management. Okay.
The next few questions are all about limits. How is the access to automations via the in-app button limited?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Inside Qlik Sense on the sheet, you can add a button like this, and then in that button, under Actions, you can choose to trigger an automation, execute automation. Then you can search for the automation. You can choose to send the selections or not. You save it, and if I now click this button, I will execute the automation. Everyone who clicks this button will be able to execute the automation.
So yeah, that's something to be considered before you enable that kind of power.
Yeah.
That kind of brings up another question. How can you see the ongoing automations happening in your tenant?
Yeah, you can go to the management console, and then you can go to automations, and here you have a full overview of all the automations in your tenant.
All right. Next question is, do I see all automations or only my personal ones?
For now, automations are only on a personal level, so yeah, you'll only be able to see your personal automations.
But you did share that option of how to export an automation
Yeah.
and share it with other people, so that's a good tip.
Indeed.
Are there security settings I can set up?
Mm,
It's kind of a
within-
general question. I'm not quite sure how to address that.
Well, within the automation itself, not really, and I'm not sure if that's necessary, because for now it's all scoped to your personal account. The automation, for example, the connections you create, those are only linked to your account, so you can't share those. And of course, if you take data from a certain system and you send it to somewhere else, it's just similar as if you would do it manually.
Mm-hmm.
The responsibility for keeping that data safe lies with you, of course. If I here export this app and I store it manually on an insecure FTP server or a public GitHub repo, yeah, then that's on me. And similar if you do it through automations, if you store it on a public GitHub repo, yeah, you've done that. So that's something you need to keep in mind. The difference is that it's just way easier to do with automations than it is to do manually.
Of course. Well, we've got time for one last question. Are there limits to how many blocks there can be in a single automation?
That's a good question. Yes, there is a limit, but I have no idea what the limit is, because it's not a limit in terms of blocks, but it's more a limit in terms of size of the automation. Here inside the automation you can add a lot of blocks and you can just keep adding them, and the limitation is that the UI will become slower if you have very big automations, or if you choose to store big strings inside these variables, because it has to get loaded every time. So if I want to store a Harry Potter novel in here, the UI will be very, very slow to load.
Okay.
But I've seen very big automations that you just have to keep scrolling, and those work fine. So you can build pretty big automations.
And you also mentioned the runtime of an hour as a limit. So if it's
indeed.
super long, it may take a while to run.
Yeah.
That's all the time we have. Thank you very much for sharing with us today.
Thanks for joining, everyone. If it's the first time you see automations, if you have the enterprise SaaS license, please just go open up a few templates, play around with it, see how it feels. If you have other questions, feel free to reach out to us. We are very active on the community, on the forum I showed. Ask any questions you have there, or reach out to your sales manager if you have any other questions.
Thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this session. Thanks to Email for presenting. We appreciate getting experts like Emil to share with us. Here is our legal disclaimer. And thank you once again. Have a great rest of your day.